For the scheme to kill Mike Williams to work, Denise Williams had to be in it. She had to help. She had to make sure that Mike didn't tell anyone about the plan to go on this trip with Brian. Let us explore that issue. As a lawyer, if you are defending a case or prosecuting a case, whether it is criminal or civil, you must learn the facts from both sides' perspectives. And then you must deeply analyze each of the versions that you receive or that you obtain. You must try to stay objective. You must try to go back in time and recreate what happened under either version you hear. If you don't go into the facts in depth, if you don't think about all the things that make sense or don't make sense about the story that you heard, then you cannot really develop a successful strategy. Again, whether as a prosecutor or even as a defense attorney. So let's use the Denise Williams case as an example. In that case, my starting point as to a key issue that makes or breaks the case, whether for the defense or the prosecution, is the question of whether Denise Williams knew that Mike was going to go hunting with Brian in the morning in question. So here is what we know that is pretty undisputable. We know that Brian Winchester killed Mike Williams at Lake Seminole, a lake that is about an hour away from Tallahassee. It's also virtually undisputable that Brian and Mike drove to Lake Seminole in separate vehicles. Mike drove in his own vehicle and took his own boat over there. We also know that Brian and Denise are both very smart people. They both went to university. They both graduated from Florida State. And if you watched the trial on YouTube or in person and you saw Brian testify, you could tell that he's an eloquent guy. Had no problems describing everything that happened, eloquently answered questions, did a pretty good job providing clear testimony. We also know, and it's pretty undisputable, that this murder was planned. This was not a spur-of-the-moment killing or a killing in the heat of passion. This was planned. So knowing all of that, there are really only two options of what happened, right? So either Brian and Mike planned to go together on this hunting trip as it is Brian's version, or Brian somehow knew that Mike was going to go hunting that Saturday morning and followed him there, or somehow, or maybe he was stalking him and followed him to Lake Seminole. That's the only other option really, but it really doesn't make any sense and it doesn't jive with any of the evidence. So to me, the only realistic option here is that Mike was planning to meet with Brian to go to Lake Seminole to go on a hunt together. Except for one issue, that if that is the case, if Brian and Mike were planning to go on this hunting trip together, then the entire plan to commit this murder and to make it look like an accident would fall apart if Mike shared that information with anyone, especially with Denise if she wasn't involved, but with any third party as well. So if mom calls him that evening before and asks him about his plans, and he shares the fact that he's going to go hunting with Brian, plan is over. Brian is suspect number one right away. And there's not going to be a search for days and weeks thinking that it was an accident. Same thing if he told a friend or he told his brother, etc. Obviously, Mike telling somebody else about this plan was a huge risk factor. Because if you watch the trial, you know that Brian Winchester was planning to have an alibi. And the alibi was, well, first of all, they were going to make the death look like an accident. Second, Brian was planning to go hunting with his father-in-law later in that morning, and so the alibi was going to be that he went home the previous night with his wife, they went to sleep together, and then he woke up very early to go hunt with his father-in-law. So that was the plan, at least. Since that was the plan, if anyone, Denise or any other family member of Mike or a friend of Mike, would suddenly start saying that, hey, wait a second, Mike told me that he was gonna hunt with Brian, this whole plan would fall apart and Brian would become a suspect. At least there would be very strong suspicion on him. So that wouldn't work. So they had to find a way to minimize that risk, to avoid that problem. And so if you have one or two smart people who are planning to commit this murder, then they're thinking about how to minimize that risk. And there were several things that would help them to do so if they were acting together. Number one, Denise could be with Mike throughout the entire time when Mike learned about the plan to go on this hunting trip. And number two, Denise also would have a lot of information about what are his customs. Does he usually tell buddies, relatives, friends about who he goes hunting with on those hunting trips? So they had to find a way to make sure as much as possible that no one knew that Mike was going to go hunting with Brian that early morning on Saturday, December 16, 2000. Based on what we know, let me explain a possible scenario that would take care of that potential problem with this plan. I'm basically extrapolating from the facts about this, that this might have happened. And I'm going to assume that Brian and Denise were co-conspirators in the case. So here's how it goes. So 1 week before, on Friday afternoon, Brian invites Mike to go hunting the next morning. Mike says yes, but says that he has to check with Denise. And he checks with Denise, and either she says no right away, or more than likely she says yes at first, but then later that night she changes her mind and says no. And so now Mike's embarrassed, he has to call Brian back and cancel the trip for the next Saturday morning. He feels bad about the situation and cancels on Brian. Jump a week ahead, jump to Friday the next week. That's the Friday right before Denise and Mike's anniversary. They already had plans for that Saturday, the next Saturday afternoon, evening to travel together. That is Mike and Denise. They were going to go have a romantic trip and celebrate their anniversary and hopefully rekindle the relationship. But that Friday night, Mike receives a phone call from Brian. Brian invites Mike to go hunting the next morning at Lake Seminole. We know that Mike was an avid hunter. He loved to hunt, just like I love to play tennis. And if I get a call, hey, let's go play tennis in 1 hour, I'll do my best to make it. If the family plans work out, I'm sure Mike did the same. He probably wasn't expecting to get a yes, but he went and asked Denise, hey, listen, can I go on this hunting trip together with Brian tomorrow morning? And so Denise says, you know what, honey, last week I made you cancel. I want you to be happy. It's our anniversary tomorrow. So as a part of my gift for our anniversary, why don't you go ahead and go with Brian and have a lot of fun? She says yes. He's surprised. He calls back Mike. He says, Brian. He calls back Brian and says, whoa, this is cool. We're gonna do this. Let's go. Let's finalize the plan. So they finalize the plans, and the plan is to meet very early in the morning, like at 3:30 in the morning. So they hang up, and what happens next? Denise is there. Denise is there with him. This must have happened at their home, probably right after they put Ainsley to sleep. So Denise could ensure that they would be together this whole time. And probably Denise tells him, listen, you gotta go to sleep early. I don't want you driving with no rest. Maybe we can go to bed together. Maybe we can, kiss and make out and start sort of celebrating for our anniversary. Whatever. The bottom line is that she's there. She's keeping an eye on him. She's making sure that he is not getting phone calls or that he's not making phone calls and that he doesn't tell anybody about this planned trip the next morning. Because if that information goes out, then she has to have a way to let Brian know so that he aborts the plan. So the fact that the plan was calling for them to meet at 3:30 in the morning then takes care of the next problem, right? So at some moment, Mike has to leave Denise and go and meet with Brian. And during that drive, he could talk to other people. So by making the plan to meet very, very early in the morning at 3:30, it's pretty impossible, pretty much unlikely at least, that Mike would call anybody. It's very unlikely that anybody would call Mike, and it would be very unlikely that they would meet anybody on their way, on Mike's way from his home to meet Brian, and then on the way from wherever they met at the gas station all the way to Lake Seminole. So again, it makes it a situation where it's super unlikely that anybody else would find out about this planned trip between Mike and Brian. And so that's how they would do it. That's how they would totally minimize the chances that Mike would let anybody else know about it. And I cannot tell you that this is exactly what happened, but I can tell you that from all the facts and from the people that we're dealing with, this sounds like a scenario that makes sense and that is probably close to what really happened. And which brings me to the main point, that Brian did it all alone. Alternative has just way too many holes, and that for this plan to have worked for Brian, Denise had to be in it. I think it's pretty straightforward, and it's unlikely that Brian was a pretty reasonable, rational, and intelligent guy would have faced such huge risks with so little reward in the end, because all the benefits pretty much would go to Denise and not him, unless Denise was involved. So I think that basically this analysis shows, to me at least, that the prosecution had a pretty much a slam dunk case here, and then Brian's testimony plus some corroboration would probably have been enough, and was ultimately enough to result in a conviction. Do you agree? Let me know in your comments, and I hope you appreciated this video, and that you subscribe. Thank you.